What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Plant the Spear Podcast. I'm your host, Jesse, and welcome to the show. I appreciate you guys joining me as we get ready to do a preview of another big matchup for Florida State this Saturday. I know I'm excited about this one. I know you guys are excited about this one. You know, this is one of them games that you circle on the calendar every single year, and especially for me now because I do live in the Carolinas. I do live around a lot of Clemson fans. In my full-time job, I work with a Clemson fan. So, look, I want some bragging rights more than you know. Like, there's a lot of games on the schedule I want to win, but Clemson is for sure one of the ones at the top of the list, especially because, you know, when I moved up to the Charlotte area in 2014, it was mid-season 2014. Actually, the funny thing was, I remember being in my new apartment that I had moved up to here, and I think the first weekend I was here was the 2014 Clemson game. And, you know, I was like, my neighbors probably think I'm insane because when Florida State won that game, you know, and every game in 2014 was won in dramatic fashion, I'm just running around and yelling and excited and everything. So, you know, this is just something that I'm really, really hope they can rebound because I'm ready to have some bragging rights again. You know, I've been up here almost 8 years now and we've won one time. So, like, I'm ready to, for the first time in a long time, you know, be able to talk a little smack back to the Clemson fans. So hopefully they can get this one, and hopefully they can kind of right the ship. I know it's not going to be an easy task. I understand that. It's going to be a close game, but, you know, you feel like Clemson has been a little underwhelming this year. You know, maybe that they're ripe for an upset, something like that. You know, I know they've pulled off in a lot of games, and their scores, when you look at the final score, it doesn't maybe indicate how close the game was before they were able to pull off. And so hopefully Florida State can get them, you know, at home inside a loud Doak Campbell Stadium, and maybe they can send Dabo and the boys packing back to Clemson. So hopefully that is the case. But we're going to get into it. We're going to talk about the game and how they can do this and what Clemson is going to be bringing to Tallahassee. So, again, I'm just real excited for this one. I know you guys are probably excited for it too. You know, I'm just ready to get into this because, man, this would be such a huge win for this program. This would be the biggest win of Norvell's career. This would be a statement win for Florida State against a top 5 team if they can pull it off. So to open things up, we'll just kind of cover some of the general game notes. Clemson did open up as a 4.5-point favorite, which is now down to 3.5. That's honestly a little closer than maybe I thought. Maybe they know some things about injuries that we're going to get some players back that maybe I don't know about. Dabo was quoted, in a press conference earlier this week saying that he thought we were getting Fabian Lovett back. I don't know. I mean, he was in street clothes in practice on Monday, but then again, Jared Verse was too and played even on a limited snap count on Saturday, the game he was coming off of injury. So, you know, maybe you do get him back even on a limited snap count, and even 20 snaps, 10 snaps, 15 snaps from Fabian Lovett would be huge in this game. So maybe they know something I don't know, but he was in street clothes on the practice video I saw Monday, so it's probably unlikely, but you know, maybe that's why it's a 3.5-point spread. I thought it would have been a little bit higher than that, even going on the road as a top 5 team versus an unranked team. You know, Florida State's one of the better unranked teams when they decide to show up and play, but you know that's a pretty low spread. So, kind of makes you feel good there because you know a lot of the Vegas people, they do this for a living. They have a lot of money on the line. They don't screw around with a lot of this stuff. So that is at least a good sign. But it doesn't really mean anything. As far as the game goes, because obviously teams don't cover the spread or do cover the spread all the time. So the over-under is at 51 points, and win probability, ESPN has Clemson with a 72.7% chance to win, PFF slightly lower at 61.3% chance for Clemson to win this game. As we know, Florida State is 4-2, 2-2 in ACC play. They are 4-2 against the spread. Clemson is currently 6-0 and 4-0 in ACC play and 3-3 against the spread. As far as your strength of schedule, which we're going to get into talking about who they played and how they performed in those games, but just from a broad view, the strength of schedule per Pro Football Focus, Florida State's currently played the 28th hardest schedule and Clemson the 78th. So maybe Florida State's a little more battle-tested now. And I know they have, out of 6 games, 3 of those were common opponents, which we're going to compare a little later too. So looking at a roster, we do know that Clemson has had more recruiting success over the past few years, given their success on the field. We're obviously aware of that. And Florida State has obviously lost some of their best players so far. But as far as PFF 70-plus graded players, now we know we talk about all the time, PFF isn't the gospel, but it is okay at pretty much pointing out who's an impact player, who's not, and 70-plus is a quality Power 5 starter. So Florida State currently has 10 on offense and 7 on defense for 17 total. Clemson is one higher at 18 total. They have 5 on offense and 13 on defense. And I even put a little sad face emoji when I put this. 6 of their 13 defensive players that are graded 70 plus are all on the defensive line. So, yeesh. But that's with a 50 snap minimum. And so, like, you even have guys like Xavier Thomas, who we know is one of the best defensive linemen in college football, who's only played 6 snaps. So he wasn't even included on that list. And unfortunately for our sake, he did make a return against Boston College. It wasn't a whole lot of snaps, so he may be limited again in this game, but that's one of the kind of the disappointing things coming out of the press conferences this week is Dabo said that Clemson is about as healthy as they've been all season. They've had multiple guys out all year, which has led to some of their struggles and slow starts. But thankfully, they're at 100% now. Well, maybe not 100%, but he said they're as healthy as they've been all season, so hooray. I mean, I hate to be like that, but, you know, you look at Syracuse. They're undefeated. They get NC State without Devin Leary. You know, last week against Boston College, Clemson had 2 safeties, I think a corner, and 2 defensive linemen, or at least 1 defensive lineman that didn't even make the trip. And now they're all going to be available for this game. So that's not so great news. But, you know, you roll with the punches, and it's something you have to deal with. And maybe Florida State can get some guys back too. I mean, I will say that we've seen in that same video that I saw Fabian Lovett in street clothes, I did see Robert Cooper at practice warming up with no braces on. And Norvell has already said this week that you're getting Ja'Kai Douglas back, which I think gives Florida State's offense a little speed threat in the slot that they haven't quite had this season. When you look at the points per game scored by both teams, Florida State's at 31.3, Clemson's at 39.3. Points allowed per game, Florida State is at 20.8, Clemson is at 18.3. Average penalties per game, sometimes it feels like Florida State should be about 50, but per game it's actually 7.67, which is still 104th in the country and not great. So that's something they're going to have to clean up this game for sure because it cost them last game, and this is a better team, so you cannot give them any freebies. I mean, you're going to have penalties. They're going to happen, but you can't just have a lot of the penalties. You can't have 10 penalties for 100 yards like they had against NC State. Luckily, Clemson isn't that much better. They do average 6 a game, which is 50th in the country. As far as turnover margin, Florida State is currently +1, which is 57th in the country, and Clemson is +7, which is 15th in the country. So this isn't going to be an easy game. There is no doubt about that. It's going to be the biggest challenge on your schedule. I mean, at least you get them at home and you don't have to play in Death Valley where they are really good. But it's not going to be an easy contest, and Florida State is going to have to play their A game. You know, you're not going to be able to spot team 7 points coming out of the half. Hopefully, Florida State actually wins the toss and doesn't defer because, you know, it's disheartening to see 2 weeks in a row now the opposing offense march right down the field and get 7 points coming out of half. And, so, you know, the coin toss sounds minute, but sometimes in a game this close that can be decided by 1 or 2 plays, every little thing counts. And so hopefully, you know, maybe that's the case. It's the little things sometimes in games like this. So we'll look at who Clemson has played a little bit first. We'll get into their schedule, and then we'll do an offensive and defensive preview. So far this season, they opened up with Georgia Tech in Atlanta. I was able to watch a majority of that game. I was actually probably like most of you, on my way back from New Orleans when they were playing that game. So because it was a Monday night game, they did win 41-10 against Georgia Tech. Now, granted, I understand Georgia Tech has won 2 games recently, and they look like a little bit of a different team since they got rid of Jeff Collins, which again is not great. Like, of course, we couldn't get the sucky Georgia Tech team, which is coming up next after Clemson, but you do get a bye week and you do get them at home. So, but we're not talking about Georgia Tech today. So that was back when Georgia Tech was kind of really bad, and they did beat them 41-10. But again, like you guys have heard me talk about in all my previews, I like to have context for everything. Context matters because you can look at the score and go, oh, 41-10. Well, of course, Clemson rolled Georgia Tech. That's exactly what they're supposed to do. But when you look at it was a 17-10 game with 5 minutes left in the third quarter, and when you watch that game, Georgia Tech actually played really well in that game for a few quarters. Now, Clemson, of course, did pull off late, but they had some success getting pressure on Clemson. Clemson had a lot of trouble stopping them through the air in that game. Now, they only threw for 164 yards, but, you know, Georgia Tech they don't do much well on offense anyway. But they had a bigger wide receiver who was able to pick on Clemson's DBs a little bit, which was nice to see. So again, context in that game. It's when you're 17-10 with 5 minutes left in the third quarter, and you finish 41-10. I mean, that game was a little closer than what it showed there at the final score. But that's the thing about Clemson, and this is going to be kind of a trend that you're going to see when we talk about each game, is how some of these games were really slow starts. Some of these games were really tight late in the game, and then they were able to pull off. And to me, that's something that I saw that I talked about earlier this season with Miami. When they played Bethune-Cookman, when they played Southern Miss, you could see that they were giving them fits at halftime, that these games were close, and these teams were giving Miami all kinds of problems. But in the second half, you could see where the depth was just too great for them to stay in the game. And you could see, like the Southern Miss game, for example, you saw in the second half where their defensive line is just leaning against guys because they're just gassed and they don't have the depth. And I said for the longest, whenever Miami actually plays a real team who has real depth and real talent, they're going to be in trouble. And that has been exactly the case so far. They still don't have a Power 5 win, and it's currently October the 13th. So that's something that I feel like with Clemson as well, is when you look at some of the lesser teams that they played. Georgia Tech, of course, is Power 5, but they're one of the worst teams in the Power 5. So they don't have a whole lot of athletes on that team. And when you look at the teams that don't have the depth that has still been able to keep up with Clemson through a majority of the game, and then they pull off late, you just wonder, like, what's going to happen when they do run into somebody who can play with them for 4 quarters, especially when you see how Wake Forest and NC State performed against them, which are two teams that I feel, are pretty similar to where Florida State is, and they were able to play a lot closer than the other teams. So moving on to the next game, Clemson played Furman. They won 35-12, which is, it's not great against an FCS team at home, 35-12. They didn't cover the spread there. And they actually got outgained in that game, 384 yards to 376. Now, I don't know how much of that was garbage time because they did kind of jump out on them early. But, still, you got outgained by an FCS team, which isn't exactly a great look, and you only won 35-12. So, game 3, they played Louisiana Tech, who is currently 2-3, not really having a good season this year. They did win 48-20. But there is also some context in that game, too. It was a 13-6 game at halftime, and Louisiana Tech had missed a field goal. So, you're talking about a one-possession game here at halftime with a 2-3 Louisiana Tech team at home. Now, Clemson lit them up for over 500 yards of offense and had 280 rushing yards on the ground. But, again, like when you talk about context, so Clemson, we know, has the second-ranked rush defense in the country. And a lot of that has to do with them holding Louisiana Tech to 6 rushing yards, which is unreal. It's almost hard to even believe. But like I told you guys, I like context because not everything is just black and white. You have to go look at some things to see. So I was interested. I said, well, is it that Clemson is really that dominant? And, of course, you do get credit for being dominant against bad teams because, Florida State has faced some poor rushing teams and given up their season highs or close to it, which is, that's not good. And so when you do hold a team that can't rush very well to 6 yards, I mean, you get credit for that. But, again, like I talked about, how good is Louisiana Tech versus how dominant is Clemson? So when I looked at Louisiana Tech, they currently have the 121st ranked rush offense. And they played one other Power 5 team in Missouri, which, Missouri's not good. They're not terrible, but they're not good by any means. They're certainly not Clemson's defense. Well, they held Louisiana Tech to 11 yards rushing. So, you kind of just have to take everything with a little bit of context there. Yeah, it's impressive to hold them to 6 yards. That is a ridiculous stat, but Missouri held them to 11. So how, they're pretty terrible at running the ball. Also in that game, I mentioned that they ran for 280 yards of rushing in that game. Well, when you look at how they performed against Mizzou ran for 323 yards in that game. So again, like when you look at some of the stat padding against these bad teams, I always like to see how they do against other Power 5 teams or other similar, again, Missouri's not Clemson, but similar level of competition. And in this game, their stats were impressive, but Mizzou had equally as impressive stats. And to me, I think Clemson beats Mizzou 9 out of 10 times. Now, I know they gave Georgia some fits and they played Florida close, but, again, Clemson's a top 5 team and Missouri is not. So Again, that's the context that I talk about. Game 4, Wake Forest, we know was a 51-45 double overtime win by Clemson, and that was an impressive game to go on the road and put up 559 yards of offense against Wake, and to be able to win a shootout like that, because last year you don't know that happens with the offense that they had, and DJ is having a better season, and so is their offense. So, Wake is not exactly a dominant defense by any means, but Florida State did struggle with that defense when they played, and now, it wasn't exactly the toughest road environment to play in. I think Clemson, they probably, when you watch the TV broadcast, they had more fans there. There was probably a little more orange than there was black and gold. So not a terrible, not a difficult place to play by any means. And Wake Forest did put up 447 yards of offense on them, threw for over 300 yards, ran for over 100 yards. And, they just had, in that game, Clemson had a hard time covering their receivers. And I know Wake Forest has a good receiving core, probably, maybe top to bottom a little better than Florida State because of some of the things with drops that we've seen. But if Florida State decides to catch the ball, they have one of the better receiving cores right up there, probably with Wake Forest, especially getting Ja'Kai Douglas back too. So they had a lot of guys out in the secondary for that game, to be fair, for Clemson. But even when they were throwing the ball, I mean, they had so many personal or pass interference calls just trying to stop those receivers because they couldn't cover them. They had 10 penalties for 120 yards, and 85 of those in the first half. 85 yards of Wake Forest, 129 yards in the first half were on pass interference calls alone. So this secondary does provide opportunities for opposing teams. Now, when you look at the next game, they played NC State at home. They won by 10 points, 30-20. And that's a quality win. You beat a top 10 team at home. But now we also know Clemson apparently doesn't lose at home, which is another reason I'm glad we're not playing in Death Valley this week. But, it was a 10-point game at home. And I think Carter Finley is a harder place to play than both Wake Forest, whatever their stadium is named, and Boston College. So, had you have flipped them games, and now I do understand Florida State lost to NC State. Florida State lost to Wake Forest, and they had them at home. But if you flip those games, you wonder if there's any difference. And I don't think NC State would have beat Clemson, but if you get them in Raleigh, that's a lot harder place to play, than Wake Forest or Boston College, even in a red bandana game. So that's the thing. They really haven't been tested in a true road environment. But I do like that NC State was able to keep it within 10 points, because when you look at the way NC State looked against Florida State, they weren't that impressive. Now, they have a pretty good defense, but their offense was not anything special. Now, I do understand that they lost Evan Leary in that game, but it's not like he was having a great game in the first half anyway. So, when you look at they were able to keep it to within 10 points on the road at Clemson, then, what does that look like when Clemson comes to Tallahassee for a team that I feel like Florida State was better than NC State in that game? They just made a lot of killer mistakes, and to me, they gave that game away. But they were the better team, at least for a majority of the game. So you look at a team that, is probably comparable on defense and has a better offense and gets them at home in a much tougher road environment. It just makes you think. Like I said, Clemson has really kind of seemed to be cutting it close a few times, and you just wonder when they're going to be against a quality team, not at home where they play really well, and maybe they get upset. So looking at last week, Game 6, they beat Boston College 31-3. Again, this was another game where it looked like a blowout, 31-3 on the road. Looks like a pretty good win, but that game was 17-3 at the end of the third quarter, and BC had missed a field goal and also had one blocked. BC also outgained Clemson by 37 yards in the first half of that game. So, that game was probably a little tougher or a little closer than 31-3 looks like, because we know Boston College is not a great team. I mean, that was a game going into the fourth quarter. When Florida State played Boston College, I mean, it was pretty much over at kickoff. Now, I have to be honest, I have to be completely honest about that Boston College game. Man, you guys know as well as I do, something about those red bandana games on the road at night at Boston College. They play so well, and every time I hear that, and they're like, "Oh, it's a red bandana game," I'm like, I'm not gonna say it on the podcast because I don't want to get tagged as explicit, but you know probably what I mean, and it rhymes with duck. So, We'll go with that. But again, you've seen some pretty close games by them where they've been able to pull off late. Now, I do worry about the depth that Florida State has given all the injuries, but if you are able to get a few guys back, you still have I feel as good about Florida State's talent level and depth across the board as I do any team that Clemson has faced. Like, to be perfectly honest, I think Wake Forest probably has more offensive talent from top to bottom than Florida State with their starting 11. Their depth players are probably not as talented as what Florida State has. Their defense is not as talented as what Florida State has. And again, Florida State is pretty thin in some areas. Like, our offensive line depth is probably, talent-wise not that great. And we're getting pretty thin on the defensive line, but, Joshua Farmer has flashed. He's played really well for you. And then you got Patrick Payton, who looks like a really nice player who's only getting better with experience. And so that's the thing. Like, when you have some guys who can come in late in the game and can hold their own while the starters catch their breath a little bit, you can find yourself in a fourth quarter game with Clemson. And if you have the horses to run with them, you can find yourself in a position to pull the upset here when you become a team that they can't just pull off from late because you're gassed. So, Florida State's going to have to play a good game for all four quarters now, but I do feel like they can really hold, if they can hold their own and they can get to the fourth quarter and be within striking distance, you have an opportunity here. And so now we'll transition to the Clemson offense. They run an average of 74.7 offensive snaps per game. They run it about 45% of the time, pass it about 55% of the time. Their offense is pretty well balanced as far as strength, and they're not really great at anything, but they're not really bad at anything either. Their total offense is 55th, passing offense 56th, and rushing offense 54th. So you can see they're pretty balanced as far as what they can do. They're not anything overly special. They're only averaging 254.8 yards passing per game. And now they do rush pretty well, 170.5 yards per game. But again, so let's get into that context that I always talk about. So when you look at the defenses that they have faced so far this season, they have faced the 17th ranked defense, which we know is NC State. Then the next closest after that was 67th, 75th, 80th, 120th, and an FCS team. And FSU is currently sitting at 27th in total defense. So this is going to be the second hardest defense that they've had to face. Now, of course, they put up 30 points on NC State, which does concern you some, but they were at home where they play well. So, they're going to move the ball. They're going to be a little bit of a challenge. DJ does run the ball well now that he's slimmed down a little bit. Will Shipley is a good back, and so they do have Phil Maffa, who's a larger back that they like to use in short yardage scenarios, and they do run the ball pretty well. So, they're going to have to strap it up and come ready to play. Their receivers do have size. They have a couple guys that are over 6 foot, two guys I think that are 6'3", but they don't really have any true scary threats out there. They don't really have anyone who's a dominant wide receiver that you're overly scared of. So, there's been plenty of teams that have had some success against this offense, and I think Florida State can too. They are they're better than they were last year. We'll just say that, and they are efficient enough to play well with their defense. So, they play well enough to allow their defense to make a few mistakes, and their defense plays well enough to allow their offense to make a few mistakes. So they're good on third down, 13th in the country currently, and in red zone offense here, this could be a problem too. They are 100% on their trips to the red zone, which they've had 32 attempts so far, which is tied for first in the country. And I know a lot of times, we get frustrated with Fuller's defense because sometimes it seems like a bend don't break where, they might give up some yards, but they do come up with some stops or hold them to field goals. But you're going to have to keep them out of the red zone in this game because they are very efficient when they get down there. Only 8 of those 32 trips have been field goals, and they do have a good kicker. So he does have some range. He is a good kicker, so that might be a disadvantage for Florida State. But again, you can have plenty of success against these guys. They have allowed 62 pressures so far this season and 9 sacks. So you're going to need to get some pressure in there. And then tackles for loss, they've allowed 4.83 per game, which is 48th in the country. So again, just to sum them up, they have a pretty middle-of-the-road offense. Nothing great, nothing special, nothing like Wake Forest. They don't run any gimmick that delayed mesh or whatever. They don't run any of that stuff. So you just line up, you strap it up, and you come ready to play. And I think Florida State can do what's necessary against this defense. This offense. This is not so much my concern as much as it is, our offense against their defense. But I don't think you're going to shut Clemson out by any means. No, I don't think that. They are pretty good. DJ is having a little better season this year than he has been, or than he did last year, and because of that, their offense is having a better season than they were last year too. So we'll transition into talking about DJ real quick. So as a quarterback, he is having a much better season than he was last year. He's currently at a 63.5% completion percentage with 1,462 yards, 14 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. Now, those numbers sound really good, and his adjusted completion percentage is 74%. He has a big-time throw rate of 9.4%, which is pretty high. His turnover-worthy play rate is 1.3, which is pretty low. So he's having a nice season. But again, like we talked about, they haven't really played but one quality defense yet. So it's not hard to look good when you're not really playing anybody, when you're not playing any top 50 defenses besides NC State. He's still been inconsistent at times as a passing quarterback. He did not have a good half against Boston College. So it's not like he's a dominant. He's not Sam Hartman, who Florida State did okay against. But, he is having a better season, and he has slimmed down some. He is a better rusher. He has 51 carries for 348 yards, which is second highest on the team. He has 3 rushing touchdowns. Now, he is a little loose with the ball when he runs. He does have 4 fumbles so far this year. So there may be some opportunity there because I know a lot of our defensive players, especially Jamie Robinson, really like to go after the ball when they do wrap a guy up. He's averaging 5.5 yards per carry, which is a solid number. He does have 21 missed tackles forced on the season and 11 runs of 10-plus yards. So, he's got enough wheels that if you let him get out into the open, he's going to make some plays on you. So they need to definitely keep him contained as much as possible. And he's still a bigger guy, so he is still kind of hard to bring down. But his PFF grade is currently 86, and his QBR is 74.9, which is 29th in the country. One thing that I did notice that will be important for Florida State in this game is to try and get pressure on DJ. So he's not been pressured a whole lot, only 26.3% of his dropbacks. But when you look at how he's performed under pressure, it's not been nearly as good, which is typical for most quarterbacks. Now, his offensive line is not great, but they haven't been terrible either. I think they struggled early in the season with some inexperienced guys, and they have picked their play up a little bit, but they also haven't really faced a dominant defensive line outside of NC State, who really isn't overly dominant, but they're probably on pace with Florida State with how they're able to get pressure, because I was actually very impressed, given the injuries, how Florida State was able to pressure NC State. That was one of the positives that I took out of that game, and hopefully they can repeat that against Clemson. So when looking at him when he's not under pressure, which has been 73.7% of his dropbacks, he has a completion percentage of 71.1%, 1,297 yards, 12 touchdowns, 1 interception, and a PFF grade of 93.3. When you are able to pressure him, his completion percentage drops down to 35%. He has 164 yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 pick, and a PFF grade of just 44.1. So if you can get pressure to him, you can have a successful game against him passing the ball, because you can make him uncomfortable and you can make him have some bad throws. Now, the trick is doing it without blitzing a whole lot, because he hasn't been blitzed a lot. He's only been blitzed 30.5% of his dropbacks, but his numbers are relatively comparable. There's not really a big difference there. So, how much Florida State can do against that offensive line with their front four, which is one thing that I do feel there are some opportunities there, because they do have a first-year starting tackle. Their right side of their line is graded kind of low on PFF. So you may have some opportunities there, because Jared Verse, as we know, that's the thing. They have some guys, but so does Florida State. Like, they have some dudes too. Jared Verse is a good defensive end. He leads the ACC. I believe I saw Florida State tweeted out a graphic yesterday about he leads the ACC in sacks currently. So, we have some guys too, and it's not going to be an easy game for this offense, just as it's not going to be for ours. But looking at their passing depth, they have behind the line of scrimmage is 21.9% of their passing offense. Their short passes, which are 0 to 9 yards, is 27.6% of their offense. And he's very effective on those, which, of course, is not hard to be. He has a 86.8% completion percentage, 368 yards, 1 touchdown, and no picks. Now, his mid-range throws, which are 10 to 19 yards, have not been as effective. It does account for 21.4% of their offense, but his completion percentage is at 51.2% with 1 touchdown, 1 pick, and he has a turnover-worthy play rate of 6.8%, which is very high. So those kind of middle of the field, mid-range throws, he has not been very effective on. Now, he does throw a good deep ball, and they do it quite often. They did it a lot against Wake Forest. So that accounts for 21.4% of their offense. He has a 43.9% completion percentage, which is pretty good on deep throws. 536 yards, 6 touchdowns, no interceptions, and a big-time throw rate of 34.8% on deep throws, which is really high. So FSU secondary is going to have to play in this game. And like I said, they do have some bigger receivers, which helps them go get those deep balls. Like I said, they don't have any dominant guys necessarily, but they do have some size at wide receiver, which we'll talk about right now. So Beau Collins is their most targeted and best receiver. He is 6'3", 205. He lines up out wide 90% of the time. So, you have to look at when you're 6'3", 205, you better bring your lunch because that's a big guy to guard. But he only catches 58.1% of the passes. And then you look at their next guy, Antonio Williams, 6 foot 180. He's one of your slot receivers. I believe he's even a freshman. And he does have a high catch rate and high contested catch rate. Joseph Ngata, which is another big receiver, 6'3", 220. And they love to use the size at their receiver. They throw some jump balls, and it was something that a lot of teams have had a hard time defending, which I noticed when you watch the tape. But he only has a 57.1% reception percentage. And he's not, he's a big receiver, but he has a low catch rate and a low contested catch rate. He's only caught 3 out of 8 contested catches. So, these guys aren't dominant. They just have size, and they're pretty good at using it. They do have a really big tight end. He's 6'6", 235 pounds, and they do like to use him in the red zone a lot because he's just he's a mismatch when you got a guy that big. But hey, guess what? So does Florida State. Now we might not like to throw it to him for some odd reason, but we have a 6'7" guy too. So looking at the running back, Will Shipley. Obviously, we know he's a good back. He runs the ball well. 76 attempts, 446 yards, 5.9 yards per attempt. I mean, he's not Travis Etienne, so let's be fair there. Like, he's got 15 runs of 10-plus yards, 280 yak yards, 22 missed tackles for us. He's hard to bring down. He's a hard-nosed runner, but he's not exactly Travis Etienne. And they also have Phil Maffa, he's averaging 4.2 yards per carry. He's their bigger red zone short yardage back. And overall, they are a pretty good rushing team, which, it does concern me not so much that they're a dominant rushing team. It's just how Florida State has performed against the run, which is kind of one of their weaknesses right now. They've lost a lot of guys in the interior, and you've seen a lot of not great rushing teams be able to run the ball on Florida State. So that is, like I said, that is one of my concerns in this game, is stopping the run and being able to run the ball. So, like we said, just to kind of round out their offense, again, you have an offensive line who's decent but not great. You have a quarterback who's having a good season but hasn't really played a whole lot of top defenses yet. You have some receivers who have good size, a big tight end, but they haven't really had a whole lot of challenges yet. And then you have some running backs who, they're solid in their own right, but they're not some of the greatest that you're going to face. So, when we move over to the defense now, this is where it's going to challenge Florida State. This is going to be the hardest thing. Obviously, we know that. So when you look at their defense as a whole, they're currently 24th ranked in the country, allowing 319.7 yards, the 95th ranked passing defense. So they are pretty mismatched on their strengths here because they have the second ranked rush defense in the country. So it's going to be, like I said, it's going to be a challenge not only for Florida State to stop the run, but to also run the ball. But as we talked about before, let's give some context to that. So when you look at the total defense for Clemson, like we said, they're top 25, 24th in the country. Well, then I start asking myself, like I always do, well, who have they played? Who have they been challenged by so far? Here's your total offensive ranks for each opponent. 41st, 87th, 90th, 113th, and 119th, and then one FCS school. And FSU currently has the 23rd ranked offense. So outside of Wake Forest, they're going to be one of the best offenses that Clemson has had to face this season. So again, they're going to be challenged too. Now, when you look at the passing defense, which we said they were 95th in, they have faced so far the 23rd, 31st, 74th, 80th, 114th, and an FCS passing offenses. The two that were ranked higher than Florida State were 23rd and 31st because Florida State has the 45th ranked passing offense. So that was Louisiana Tech and Wake Forest, who Louisiana Tech can actually throw the ball pretty well. They just can't run worth a flip. But both of those teams threw for over 300 yards against Clemson. Even when you take away the overtime yardage for Wake Forest, they still would have thrown for just over 300 yards. So that's the thing. The two better offenses that they have faced both kind of lit up Clemson secondary. So it makes you feel like, I don't know that Florida State's going to throw for 300 yards, but surely the opportunity is there. And like we talked about before with the Louisiana Tech rushing offense, when you move over to the rushing defense, they are second in the country. They only allow a very impressive 63.7 yards per game. But again, when you look at some of the rushing offenses they faced, it's just terrible. They faced the 70th, 78th, 87th, 121st, and 128th best rushing offenses. So they have not faced one top 50, top 60, even rushing offense this season. Florida State currently sits at the 25th best rushing offense. Now, Florida State does average about 205 yards rushing per game. Do I think they're going to rush for 205 yards? Probably not. But if you can get to triple digits, which Furman ran for 128 yards against them. Wake ran for 110 yards against them. If you can get to triple digits, you can open up enough things in the pass game. I feel like Florida State can score some points. So that's something to watch for. They have some limitations up front on offense. I do get that. Clemson's defensive line is going to be healthier than they have been all season, but they're a good run defense, and I'm not taking anything away from that because they shut down bad teams, which is something that Florida State really has not done as far as the run game goes. But again, when you look at, they just haven't really played any good rushing teams this season. I do understand they have a very talented defensive line who's had pieces missing in a lot of their games, and now they all look to be back. Hooray for us. But, and Florida State does have a liability at right tackle. They are mismatching some pieces or mixing up some pieces or whatnot. They're working in Darius Washington at guard and things like that. So they've not had the most success on the offensive line, which does concern me in this game. And this is probably going to be, in my opinion, where the game is decided. How well can Florida State block Clemson in the trenches? That is, and how well can they get pressure on DJ? That is really what the game is going to come down to. Because if you can give some time to Jordan and the receivers do decide to catch the ball, you have some opportunities here. But I just like to have that context to everything and look at who they played and how they performed and why they're so good like that. And just by rankings-wise, this will by far be the best rushing attack they have had to face this season. When you look at their third down defense, they're pretty good, 46th in the country. Their red zone defense is 67th in the country. Now, again, like we just talked about, in the trenches, where this is my main concern for this game, and protecting Jordan Travis and allowing him to take advantage of the secondary, which is their weakness. When you look at the pressures they have been able to create, and this is considering Xavier Thomas has only played 6 snaps this season. This is considering Brian Bresee has been out for multiple games, and they've had some guys down with injury. They have created 132 pressures this season. Youch. Like, that is a lot. The next closest on your schedule is NC State at 101, and LSU currently has 88 pressures on the season. And given it's usually about somewhere between 15 and 30 pressures in a game, that's like they've almost played a whole nother game. So they are able to pressure a lot, and it's going to be a long night for this offensive line. There is no doubt about it, especially considering the guys they get back. Because like when you look at Xavier Thomas, he made his first appearance of the season against Boston College. He only played 6 snaps, and we know BC's offensive line is terrible. But he had 6 snaps, and 4 of those were pressures with 2 sacks. I mean, that's ridiculous. So it's gonna be hard. It's gonna be hard, and I'm sure they've seen how Jazz has struggled at tackle, and I'm sure they're going to try and expose that because they have very good defensive ends. And Florida State's going to have to do something. They're going to have to leave a back end or put a tight end over there who our tight ends are not that great at blocking. So they're going to have to find a solution to that, move the pocket or do something, because these defensive ends are going to expose him because he's not been great. And that's not to pile on the kid. It's just calling it what it is. The Clemson defense is currently averaging 8 tackles for loss per game, which is 7th in the country, and they currently have 6 interceptions on the season, which is 35th. So once you just kind of take a quick rundown of their personnel, KJ Henry, defensive end, he has 22 pressures, 1 sack, 1 forced fumble, PFF grade of 81.6. Then you have Miles Murphy, 16 pressures, 3 sacks, PFF grade of 79.6. So again, I mean, these guys are good. This is an elite defensive line. You have a defensive tackle, Tyler Davis, 14 pressures, 3 sacks, PFF grade of 81.5. And I can't say this kid's name, so I'm just going to go with the first name, Rook. 11 pressures, 2 sacks, PFF grade of 73.1. And again, Xavier Thomas should be back for this game, and Brian Bresee. So that is, it's not, we knew this was going to be a challenge. And in the preseason, I predicted Florida State to lose this game, and that was solely based on the fact I didn't think they were going to be able to block this front. And I think they had 6 sacks on Jordan last year in that game. Now, I don't know whether this offensive line, obviously it is a little bit better, but again, you have a real liability at tackle, and hopefully he can step up and play a good game. Maybe him coming from South Carolina, maybe he hates Clemson a little more than everybody else, from that rivalry game, and maybe he plays out of his mind this game, but we're going to need that for sure because this is going to be a challenge. They have big, fast, physical linebackers who all grade out pretty well on PFF, and then when you go to the secondary, like we talked about, this is where your opportunity is going to lie. And don't get me wrong. I don't want to make it sound like their defense is totally an immovable object because they have given up some yards. Like I said, they got outgained by Furman. Now there may have been some garbage time in there, but still they gave up 384 yards to Furman, an FCS team. Their secondary is pretty, it's not great, but they've had a lot of pieces missing too. So I'm not sure how well they're going to be when they're back at full strength, and I'm not even sure how the guys are gonna how full strength they're gonna be because I know Dabo said one of their guys, like he's a safety / corner, Makuba, he had a dislocated elbow in practice, and he's back and he's available, but he has to wear a brace the rest of the season because he's not able to straighten his arm to 100%. So again, you get some guys back, but how close are they to 100%? So they had a lot of trouble covering Wake Forest, and they had a lot of pass interferences in that game because they just got beat consistently, and they could not handle that receiver core. So if Florida State's if their receivers can decide to catch the ball this game, and they said that they've had a much better week in practice, hopefully they're rising to the challenge of knowing they had a bad game, which realistically cost them the game at NC State. If they can rise to the challenge and they can catch the ball this week, you like what Johnny Wilson can do. You like Micah Pittman. You like having a Ja'Kai Douglas back, who, like we talked about before, he's a burner, man. That guy's got wheels. I think he can really do some work in space if you can get him the ball. And that's not something Florida State has had. Micah Pittman is a great slot receiver, but he's not near as fast as Ja'Kai Douglas. And we've seen Ja'Kai, he's broken some before where you get him the ball in space coming out of the backfield, and he breaks it for a big one. So, if they can protect Jordan enough to let them get some plays off, then you feel good about what you can do against this defense. It's just going to be blocking them. That's really what it's going to come down to. And I will say that their secondary, even most of the guys that had a lot of the snap percentage, when you look at where their reception percentage allowed, like how many passes they've been targeted to how many they've allowed, their reception rates are pretty high. I mean, you're looking at 75%, 66.7%, 50%, 83.3%, 81.3%, 85.7%. So it's not like they're getting a lot of PBUs. It's not like they're breaking up a lot of passes. It's not like you can't get completions on them. So, Florida State is going to have to throw the ball a lot in this game if they want to win. That's going to be one of the keys to their success, is giving Jordan time and throwing it a lot. But you're still going to have to run the ball some, and it's going to be difficult. But I do feel like, and to be honest, in this game, unless your defense just plays lights out, you're probably going to need to get in the 20s, I would say, at least. Like maybe 24 to 21, like if Florida State can win, can pull the upset or something, you're going to think something like that. And Clemson's offense is, the lowest point total they've been held to all season was 30 points against NC State. Now, granted, again, they were at home, so, you feel like you're going to have to get into the 20s, and it's going to be a challenge, but I feel like they can do it, but they're going to have to play a really clean game. They can't get any more drive-killing penalties. They can't get any more penalties that back you up from 3rd and 2 to 3rd and 17. They just can't, which is what we saw last week. They can't have those things. And you're going to have to catch the ball. All 5 or 6 of their drops last week all came on 3rd or 4th down when it was crucial and you needed it most. against this type of defense, you have to make those plays if you want to win this game. And so hopefully they rise to the challenge, because this is going to be the best defense. Realistically, I know NC State's probably, I would almost say, a more well-rounded defense just because of how bad Clemson's past defense has been. But this is going to be the best front seven you're going to face all season. So they better pack a lunch, because it's going to be quite the challenge. Now, like I said, they're not an immovable object. It's just not going to be easy. So when you look over, we'll just do a quick talk about special teams real fast. So their kick return is currently 118th in the country. Their kick return defense is 29th in the country. Punt return is 107th in the country, and they did muff 2 punts against Boston College. One of them was on friendly fire, but hey, the thing is, and Dabo did say he was going to evaluate their return position, and they may put a freshman back there who had a nice return against Boston College, but hey, he's a freshman, and freshmen make mistakes. Like we talked about before, when you have a game like this, where it can come down to the last possession, where it can come down to things, 1 or 2 plays, a muffed punt could be the difference, and so that could be something to watch. Their punt return defense is 68th. Their net punting is 108th. Now, unfortunately, like we talked about, their field goal kicker is pretty good. 22 of 22 on PATs, 10 of 11 on field goals from all different ranges. And the last thing we'll talk about before we wrap up is the common opponents, which has been NC State, Wake, and Boston College. So when you look at the two, and just not to keep this too long, to kind of keep it short, Florida State against NC State did better on offense by looking at some of the things. And what I looked at was yards per play, success rate, explosive play rate, stuffed run rate, which is how many runs you had get stopped for 0 yards or less, havoc rate allowed, and stopped rate, which is how many drives you had that ended in punts, turnovers, or turnovers on downs, which is basically no points. Because, again, you have to understand games are in different situations, whether you have someone trying to milk the clock in garbage time, or whether you have someone trying to play catch up. It adjusts for the different pace of the game. So, and the defense's ultimate job is to get off the field without allowing points. So when you look at NC State, Florida State had a better offensive game, and Clemson had a better defensive game in almost all the categories, which is what you would expect. Florida State averaged 7.36 yards per play, whereas Clemson only averaged 5.66. On defense, and the thing is, too, a lot of the categories where Florida State didn't do as well as Clemson against these opponents, they weren't far off. And so when you look at, on the defense, they allowed 4.32 yards to NC State, whereas Florida State allowed 5.3. And then when you look at Wake, Clemson averaged 6.5 yards per play against them, and Florida State averaged 6.24. And Florida State really struggled in that Wake Forest game, and Clemson's offense was better in every offensive category that I looked at in that game, but it wasn't by a whole lot. Now, it was really close. But as far as defense goes, Florida State actually had a much better defensive game than Clemson did. They were ahead in all but one category and tied in another. So they allowed 4.67 yards a play, whereas Clemson averaged giving up 6.57 yards per play. So a pretty considerable difference there. Now, to be fair, I will say I think Wake aired it out a lot more against them than they did Florida State, because they knew that secondary was depleted and they knew that they were a weakness, which hopefully is something Florida State can copy from that game plan. Now, against Boston College, Florida State was better in every offensive category I looked at besides success rate, and it wasn't that far off. Florida State averaged 8.28 yards per play against BC, where Clemson only averaged 5.78 yards per play, which is a pretty big difference. When you go to defense, Florida State gave up 4.14 yards per play. Clemson gave up 3.65 yards per play. Clemson was better on defense in success rate and havoc rate, stop rate, and run stuff rate. Florida State limited less explosive plays. And, I mean, that, like I said, that was pretty much, I mean, we know Clemson has a better defense, at least running and the front seven, than Florida State has, especially being down a few guys. So that's not a surprise. So, again, just on paper, looking at common opponents, I mean, it looks like you have two pretty evenly matched teams. Now, as far as how they performed anyway, like we said, I know Clemson has more talent up front than Florida State, but, we got some dudes too. So it looks like it could be, This is going to set up to be a really good game. If it was in Clemson, I would be a lot more concerned just because of how hard it is to win there. But, knowing that you get them at home, knowing that, and we'll go ahead and wrap it up here, but knowing that you get them at home and that this is going to be the toughest road environment they played in. We heard Boston College players tell their coaches they could not hear in that game. And sometimes in a game like this, like we talked about with the muff punt, sometimes it only takes one miscommunication for the receiver to run the wrong route that could end up in a pick or a pick six even or something like that could sway the game the other way. Look how quick we saw the NC State game go from all momentum going towards Florida State to it seemed like you knew it was coming because they scored a touchdown and got a 3 and out, and it felt like the game was almost over at that point because all the momentum had shifted the other way. So sometimes it doesn't take much. And so I think you add in the environment that they're going to have to play in, the toughest road challenge that they've had to play so far this season. I think Florida State, top to bottom across both sides of the ball, is probably I would say the best team that they've had to face because, again, like we said, Wake Forest has a really good offense, but their defense is not that good. NC State has a really good defense. Their offense was not that good, especially when we watched them, in that last game. So I feel like Florida State is just more balanced than those teams on both sides of the ball. Now, that doesn't mean they have an elite defense or an elite offense, but they don't really have a glaring weakness or one side of the ball that's significantly worse than the other, like both of the other teams that they've faced that were able to keep it close games. So, just when you see what Wake's offense was able to do against Clemson, and then when you see how they've had some slow starts. They've had some games where it was a lot closer against bad teams in the fourth quarter that, like we talked about earlier, if you're able to get this game into the fourth quarter and still be within striking distance, you have a really good chance at getting a huge win at home and pulling off a top 5 upset here. So I know this is going to sound like a cop-out, and I realistically do believe Florida State can win this game. I feel like they can be the team because when I look at Clemson, it's almost like they've been playing with fire too many times, and you're just waiting for them to get burnt. They were close against BC. They were close against Georgia Tech late. They were close against Wake Forest and ended up winning in double overtime. So it's like they've kind of got by a few too many games, and you just wonder at what point are they going to get caught lacking. And so by a team who's able to beat them, and I feel like Florida State is a team that can do that. And you get them at home, you get them in a tough environment, you have the talent to compete with them. But the biggest thing for me right now is seeing where these two teams have tracked over the last 2 to 3 weeks. Florida State, their play has been not as good the last 2 weeks. Their players, they're just dropping like flies. And hopefully we get some guys back, but you don't even know how healthy they are. And you look at Clemson, they have found, I know they were in a tight game with BC, but they just beat NC State. They beat Wake. They have gotten better as the season has gone, and now they're as healthy as they have been. So they've won those games despite injuries where Florida State did not. And so it's just hard for me. Like I said, this is going to sound like a cop-out because I hate picking against Florida State. Like, I will be perfectly honest with you. I'm not state-run media. I'm a fan first, and I do this because I enjoy it, and I do this because I love it, but I hate picking against Florida State. There's a funny story. When I used to play NCAA football game, you'd be in dynasty mode, and you'd be building a program up. I am so against picking Florida State to lose or so superstitious about it or whatever. If I'm ever in a game where Florida State is I'm going to lose on Heisman mode or something like that, I'm turning it off because I can't make them take that L. I just can't do it. So that's why I usually don't use Florida State when I play those video games. So that's the thing is I hate picking against Florida State. And so I'm not going to. I'm going to take this is my show. I can do what I want. So I'm not going to pick it. I'm not even going to give you a score because it's so hard to pick, I think. You just don't know. Like, if Fabian Lovett dresses out for this game, if Robert Cooper is back, you got a really good chance. If Robert Cooper isn't at 100%, if Fabian Lovett is a total no-go, I just have a hard time seeing them beat this team. I will at least say this. I predicted them to be 4-0 to begin the season. I predicted them to be 4-3 after this 3-game stretch if Sam Hartman was back. So I don't feel good about it, and I'm not confident that they can do it. But like I said, Clemson has been playing with fire a little bit here lately, and I do feel like they are ripe for an upset. I do feel like this, there's just something, it's weird, like I can't describe it. There's something in my gut that just feels like Florida State's going to rebound. They're going to be pissed off after those last 2 losses. And the way they play, the way they fight, the way the culture is at Florida State now, I don't think there's any quit in this team. I don't think they're going to lay down at all. I think they are going to rise to the challenge. And like I said, something in my gut tells me that Florida State is going to be the team to catch Clemson and knock them off. I just don't know that it's going to happen just because of the health of the teams and because of where we're at with each front 7. If they didn't have Xavier Thomas, if Brian Bresee was still out, if they still had 3 guys out in their secondary or something like that, I'd feel a lot better about it. But I'm not picking Florida State to lose. I'm just saying it's going to be a really hard game to win. So I'm kind of taking a mulligan on this one because I'm so torn on it. And if you do lose this game, I don't think it's a complete disappointment. I mean, they are a top 10 team. They are a top 5 team. They are, they're not great, but I mean, they're still 6-0, and they've still beat 2 teams who are currently in the top 15 that Florida State did lose to. So it's not like you're losing to a bad team, and it would be a monumental win. And I really hope they do. I mean, golly, I hope they are able to pull this off. So we'll just leave it at that, guys. I mean, they got a chance. I believe in them. I believe that they can beat Clemson. I believe that they can be the team to finally catch them slipping. I'm not putting money. I'm not putting money on it. I'm just gonna leave it at that. So I appreciate you guys tuning in. Hey, go Noles! Like, let's get it done. Someone needs to put Dabo back in his place. I mean, what the heck? Like I said last episode, what the heck is a Dabo anyway? Stop losing to this guy. Let's get it done. They don't have Venables anymore. They don't have their championship coordinators anymore. They're still a good team, but they're not unbeatable. They haven't really, they beat up on a lot of bad teams, and of course they did, like we said, they won the 2 games that you lost, but it's not like they dominated either team. So you do feel good about your chances getting them at home. So this is a hard one to predict. My head says Clemson, my heart says Florida State, and my gut says Florida State too. So who knows? We'll just have to wait and see. But hopefully, as long as they come with their A game, as long as they don't make the stupid penalties and the stupid mistakes, they really do have a chance in this one. So we'll just wrap it up there. I'm going to take the mulligan on this one. I do apologize if that's a disappointment. If you were waiting on a score, I could see Florida State winning this one like 24-21 in an upset. I could also see them losing this game, something like 31-21 or something like that if they don't come ready to play or they just can't stop that defensive line. But, we'll have to wait and see. But they've been in every game. I know the Wake game was kind of ugly, but they were able to claw back into that one. So it's not like they've been dominated in any game. They play hard, and they've been in every game. So I don't think this one's going to be any different. I think it will come down to the end, and I hope they find a way to win, because that has been this team's biggest Achilles heel right now, is they have just found ways to let teams come back or found ways to lose games the last few weeks. And even against LSU, when you fumbled on the one, then you gave up a 99-yard touchdown drive that almost cost you. You have to find a way to win. You have to play for 4 quarters. And if they can do that, you never know what can happen in Doak Campbell Stadium on a Saturday night. You just really never know. And, man, would this be a huge win for them. So, I'm going to be cheering. I know you're going to be cheering, and we'll just hope for the best and hope they can get it done, because I sure would love to right the ship. I would love to get back to winning and end this 2-game skid and then get ready for the rest of the season, where you do have a lot of winnable games. But this is the toughest one on your schedule right now. So I do appreciate you guys tuning in. I do appreciate all your support, and we'll catch you on the other side. Screw Clemson. Go Noles.